All right, well, welcome back. This is session 2 of our diversity discussion here. And today we're going to dive a little bit more in depth to some of the talking points that we did in the first session. The first session was more so of an overview, and I gave you a lot of numbers and I gave you a lot of statistics. With this session here, we're going to look more at the definition of our asylum seekers, our refugees, and our immigrants, and investigate some of the laws and the changes in laws that had both positively and negatively affect certain refugee and immigrant groups. So without further ado, here we go. And again, my partner in all this is Cassie Onstead, the ABE Adult Basic Education Director. So for this here, our discussion point that we want you all to think about is what makes an immigrant illegal? We hear a lot about this topic in the news, in the media, on the radio, about undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants coming into the border, and depending on what point of view you take, you may feel it's either a positive or a negative. We're not here to convince you one way or another. We would just want to give you some facts so that you can have some things to ponder about and to further grow in your understanding of this area here. So the question is, what makes an immigrant illegal? And after we provide you some information here, maybe your minds will change into how you think of an illegal immigrant. First of all, just to start, the definition of an immigrant is a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. An immigrant or permanent resident alien is an alien admitted to the U.S. as a lawful permanent resident. And in the last session, we went through the immigration timeline, and of course, since the beginning of the United States as we know it, our country has been settled and lived and worked by immigrants. Immigrants from Europe, Northern Europe, the British Isles, immigrants from Middle and Southern Europe, and then later on, immigrants from Southeast Asia, the Eastern Europe, and also more recently from East Africa and Central America. The reason that we investigated as to why these people came was pretty common throughout the history of the United States. Mainly, it sums it up for better opportunities, whether their native country had war, famine, natural disasters, tribal conflicts. A lot of the people who came because of terrible situations are here in the United States to seek better opportunities and to find new opportunities for their families to live their life and not just trying to survive day by day by the hardships of war, famine, and everything else. So going a little bit further, we have the definition of asylum seekers, and that's what we're investigating today here. This will be our primary focus, is who our asylum seekers are, and then we'll touch a little bit on our refugees, but we'll do more of refugees in our next sessions. But an asylum seeker is someone who requests for sanctuary, and their request has yet to be processed. Every year, around 1 million people seek asylum here in the United States. National asylum systems are in place to determine who qualifies for international protection, usually as a result of mass violence or conflict. So not all immigrants are asylum seekers. All asylum seekers and all refugees are immigrants. So here are some pictures of some famous asylum seekers that we know throughout our history. One in particular that I want to talk a little bit further here is actually the grandfather of President Trump. Just to make sure I get his name correctly, Frederick Trump. Yes, is the grandfather of President Donald Trump here. And Frederick Trump actually came to the U.S. as an unaccompanied minor. Actually, he struggled to find employment in Germany, and life was really hard. Without proper employment, there was not enough money for him to help his parents out. He was only a kid at the time, and he was working at different barbershops, trying to help his family meet ends meet. So eventually, his mother sent him to the United States, and he came here as an unaccompanied minor through Ellis Island, and eventually, had a good, positive life, lived a good, positive life, and really is now the grandfather of the President of the United States here. So, with Frederick Douglass being an asylum seeker himself, and knowing his story of struggle and success, it does question that, makes us question: Do people deserve that opportunity to make a better life for themselves? And if they have that opportunity, what can they do? And really, who has the responsibility to really limit and say no to some of those opportunities? Obviously, with the situation of Frederick Douglass, and comparing to our situation now, how we determine the legality of unaccompanied minors and who is allowed into our country has changed, which also then put into question and to the statement that we posed earlier is, what makes an immigrant illegal? Now, just some more data here. Each session we do have a lot of slides to give you some information and some data on the numbers of immigrants into the U.S. And this one here, we do a lot of side-by-side comparison with the United States and with Minnesota. The projected change in immigration, the United States went from 43 million in 2015 to 78 million projected to be in 2060. That is up 18.8% of the population would be foreign-born if the projection holds true. Minnesota is not keeping pace with the change in the U.S. As in 2014, we had 428,000 foreign-born population, and now we are projected to be at 870,000 in 2060. So going up from 7.8% to 13% of our population. Well, the growth is faster in Minnesota, but the total percentage of foreign-born to native residents of Minnesota is a lot smaller than that of the total population of foreign-born in the United States. So again, more comparisons of immigrants to Minnesota compared to the U.S. From 1850 on, as you can see, actually the rise in immigration came in the early 1800s and in the late 1800s, early 1900s here. That was the peak of immigration in Minnesota and all in the Midwest, and also they were at the peak there. There's a few peaks here in the United States, but also in the United States as well. At that time, in the early 1900s, Minnesota did have a much higher foreign-born percentage than the rest of the United States there. However, as time went on, as you can see here, the percentage of foreign-born in the U.S. is higher than the percent of foreign-born in Minnesota. Some people may think that, with the number of immigrants here in the U.S. that this may be a new thing with immigrants coming in, but actually it's not. The U.S. and Minnesota in particular has had a long history of accepting immigration to the state and to the country. We are nowhere near what we accepted in the early 1900s. So here's another number. So for Minnesota here, it seems like we are hitting another peak in terms of numbers of foreign-born. Again, our numbers were still higher back in the early 1900s. But it is getting to that point again when we were back in 2010 here. But we do have more data that I'll present more in the next session here. Our percentage has declined a little bit in 2017 and 2018. So it's actually natural for immigration to have these rise and peaks here. And among the different ethnicities, you see that in the early 1900s, the largest ethnic group to come to Minnesota were actually the Swedish immigrants. If you go back a little bit further, it was the German immigrants. And then the Norwegian immigrants also had high numbers in the early 1900s. More recently, we've had lower numbers of immigrants to Minnesota. However, people from Mexico make up the highest number of immigrants to Minnesota here from 2007 to 2016. Minnesota's immigrant population is quite a bit different from the U.S. population. Half of the U.S. population of immigrants actually come from Latin America, whereas in Minnesota there's actually only 22% that comes from Latin America. The majority of our immigrants to the U.S. actually is in Asia. Now, in Faribault is from Asia. I'm sorry. In Faribault, we may not feel that the Asian immigrants are the largest immigrants because we don't have that high of a population here in our city. But if you remember back to the 1980s, when we were resettling refugees from the Vietnam War, we had a large population of Cambodians and Vietnamese immigrants to come to our city here. In the state here, there's still a large number of Hmongs that are resettled in Minnesota, and Hmongs are a tribe in Laos that helped the United States during the Vietnam War. The population of Hmongs in St. Paul is actually close to 60,000 in just that one city. So there is a large number of Asian refugees and immigrants in Minnesota here. And then more recently, our East African numbers are growing as well as we resettle refugees from Somalia, from Sudan, from Ethiopia. They are a few of the ethnic groups that make up 28% of our African immigrants to the U.S. In the rest of the United States, yes, there is a high Asian population comparable to that in Minnesota here, but the African immigrants are quite a bit lower than what we resettled in our state of Minnesota. Moving on to refugees. Now, refugees are asylum seekers, but their asylum is approved differently from what we normally refer to as asylum seekers. Refugees would flee an area of conflict into, not necessarily a safe area, but a safer area from their area of conflict into refugee camps. And from the refugee camps there, they are processed for refugee status and then allowed into the United States. So the definition of refugee here is a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinions, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War, ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugees fleeing the country. Here are some pictures of famous refugees in the United States here. Mila Kunis, Alec Weck from Sudan, Gloria Estefan, Iman. These are all pictures of famous refugees here that have come to the United States. Mila Kunis I actually didn't know of until this the research that we did for these series here. She requested asylum from the Soviet Union when Ukraine was going through earlier conflicts with the Soviet Union, not the recent Ukraine-Russia conflict here, but back in the mid to late 80s when Russia and the Soviet Empire was falling apart. So refugee admission to the United States, really the definition of refugees did not come around until 1980 when they had the UN Convention on Refugees to decide what the definition of a refugee was. But at that time, you see in the 80s, we had close to over 200,000 refugees resettled in the U.S. That number has dropped drastically to 13,501 in 2018 here. It was recently raised in the last year of Obama to the ceiling of 110,000, but that ceiling was never met. And when President Trump came in, he did reduce the ceiling to 45,000, which was the lowest in history, and that ceiling is now continued to be reduced for the year of 2019 as well. The ceiling, I believe, here is set at 30,000. Foreign-born population in the U.S., like I said earlier, 44 million is the total number of foreign-born population in the U.S. Number of undocumented immigrants, some may refer to undocumented immigrants as illegal immigrants. That is roughly 11 million people. 75%, so if you do the math here, 75% of immigrants to the U.S. come through legal means. It's very important to remember that as we discuss much of in the news about undocumented immigrants. We have to remember that really 75% of immigrants coming to the United States are coming in through legal means. And these are the types of immigrants that are mostly admitted to the U.S. here. As you can see, 48%. Most of the immigrants coming to the United States are spouses, children, or husbands of U.S. citizens. So if you have a wife living abroad, you would certainly file a petition to have her with you, or you have children abroad, you can certainly file a petition to have your children with you. And actually that makes up the bulk of our immigration to the United States, is that immediate family reunification of U.S. citizens. If you take the Vietnam War, for example, a lot of our military personnel who've been fighting for years over in Vietnam may have established family relationships over there, and at that time, the late 90s, they were filing petitions to bring family to rejoin them. Adopted children from Korea and everywhere else, families would bring them over to rejoin them in the United States here. So that is the bulk of the immigration to the United States. 20% is more general and extended family reunification. This then goes to parents, cousins, uncles, brothers, sisters, coming to rejoin family here. This actually affects a lot of our refugees who may have been separated from each other during war. Once they've come to the United States and are able to establish citizenship here, and then rediscover that their family is still alive, a lot of them will try to file for a petition to bring family over to rejoin them. 12% of our immigration come here as employment, and employments are from agricultural workers, seasonal migrant workers, all the way to our doctors at the Mayo Clinic, engineers at IBM, taking the Minnesota example here, would come to the United States on a work visa for employment. 13% of our immigration to the U.S. are refugees and asylum seekers. And then there's a special category here of lottery winners. I'm not so fully aware of how the process works, but I do know of immigrants who have been in a lottery system in their country and has been able to win visas that were granted by U.S. embassies to come to the United States here. And that is a small 4% of the immigrant population. and they would use that lottery to come, study in the United States or to come find employment in the United States here. So 1951 was when the Refugee Conventions took place, and actually, so I misspoke earlier on. I said 1980 was when the Refugee definition was created. No, it was actually 1951 when the Refugee Convention met and defined what a refugee was. So in the Refugee Convention, it ensures that the international protection of uprooted people worldwide. U.S. immigration laws states that refugees fleeing violence and persecution in their home countries can request asylum and two related forms of protection from an immigration judge: withholding of removal and protection under the UN Convention Against Torture. The Immigration and National Acts permit individuals to seek asylum without regard to the manner in which they enter the country. So under U.S. laws and also under UN laws, people have the right to come to our borders and request asylum. So some of the undocumented immigrants that we are talking about that are coming from Central America here, undocumented may be a term that we can use to describe some of the immigrants, but definitely really not illegal immigrants, because really they're not taking any illegal access or illegal process to come into the United States, because the law grants them that right to request asylum. The court will hear their case and then decide what to do based on the history that each individual brings in. If the court does prove that they have proper reason to request asylum here, whether they're fleeing violence in their home country from war or from gang violence or anything else, they can certainly grant them the approval of asylum, but they do have a right to a hearing, and they do have a right to request asylum upon entering the border of the United States. That is just one of the many laws that we have that have been changing and evolving throughout the history of the U.S. here. Pre-President Trump, and I'm going to just highlight a few of them in red here. In the late 1700s, unindentured white males must live in the U.S. for 2 years first before becoming a citizen, but later was extended to 14 years. So not everybody living in the United States at that time had the opportunity to be citizens of the United States. This is not in red here, but I want to highlight this too. In early 1924 and prior, really what they did to admit asylums or to approve asylum seekers coming into the United States was what they called a 6-second physical. And really that's when an immigration personnel on Ellis Island or Angel Island would look at the immigrants coming in and do a 6-second physical assessment to see if they're able-bodied enough to work in the U.S. If they were able-bodied enough, they would allowed to be entered in the United States. President Trump's grandfather, Frederick Trump, got into the United States under this 6-second physical examination rule. The Exclusion Act was something that also took place, and this was barring immigration to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act is talked about somewhat in our history books from 1882 to 1943, but then there was also a more expanded Exclusion Act, the Asian Exclusion Act, that took place from 1924 to 1965, barring all Asians from entering the United States at the time. In more recent immigration laws, the 1996 Immigrant Responsibility Act allows for deportation of legal refugees and immigrants to the United States. A lot of the deportations and some of the family separation that goes on does not only affect undocumented immigrants here, but it also affects legal refugees as well. Refugees and immigrants who came in under legal status are also in danger of being deported if they don't follow the laws written in the 1996 Immigrant Responsibility Act. During President Trump's time, immigration has been a focus, and there are many actions that he has taken to affect immigration policies in the United States here. On June 15, 2017, he rescinds the deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful residents. November 20th, 2017, Trump ends the protective status for Haitian refugees. In January of 2018, he ends protective status for El Salvadorian refugees. And in November 9th, 2018, President Trump tried to deny asylum for families who did not enter at a port of entry. Of course, many of these things here have been challenged or are still being challenged in courts. We've also heard of, some refer to it as the Muslim ban. It was the suspension of immigration from 6 majority Muslim countries, known as the travel ban. And then there's also the suspension of refugees and immigrants coming in for a little while as they renewed the vetting process as well. And that happened back in the January 27th of 2017. And of course, earlier on in that, and since January 25th of 2017, the border wall has been in discussion. Some of the things in place here, DACA has been in quite a bit of discussion. Ending of the diversity lottery, ending of birthright citizenship, ending of family reunification, and the expansion of public charges, and then the reduction of the refugee ceilings. All this have been in discussion and is in the works, but again, there are public comments that are being made on some of these things here, and many are still being challenged in the courts. But it does, what has happened with all these discussion around some of the policy changes on immigration, immigration has become a forefront of some of the both political support and political attacks. So after that information, we revisit our original question and ask if any of the information given here changes your minds and views on what is an illegal immigrant and what makes an immigrant illegal.